the man had done everything right. His cattle were penned, crops stored, house thatched, family settled beside a fire. He looked at what he had secured and said to the sky, "If you wish to reign, then reign." The man sitting nearby heard this and replied with a different kind of accounting. His cattle were the faculties of a trained mind. His house needed no thatching. Nothing outside could enter to disturb it. His fire had already gone out. The fire most people spend their lives feeding without knowing they are feeding it. He said to the same sky, "If you wish to reign, then reign." Two men, the same words, entirely different weights. One had secured everything he could reach. One had stopped needing to. This exchange sits in one of the oldest collections in the Buddhist canon, and it is where tonight begins. Over 3 hours, you will also hear a monk who walked toward violent people by choice, and why fear had nothing left to attach to when he arrived. A poet monk who caught himself being proud of his own spiritual progress, returned for help, caught himself again, and kept returning for years. And a riverside teaching that redefines what it means to live truly alone. Everything tonight comes from the Pali Canon, the oldest surviving record of what the Buddha taught. Unhurried and exact. Get comfortable wherever you are. Leave where in the world you are listening from in the comments. Everything that follows is yours to receive at whatever pace your body needs tonight. The river Mahi ran through broad, flat plains, and along its banks, a man named Daniya had made a life that satisfied him completely. His cattle were good cattle, healthy, well grazed through the long dry season, now penned for the evening in an enclosure that had taken genuine effort to build. His house was thatched against the coming rains. His crops were stored. His wife and children were warm beside a fire, settled into the particular ease of an evening when the day's labor is finished and the next day's has not yet begun. He had done more than this. He had tended his calves and his older animals through the dry season. He had earned what needed to be earned and given what needed to be given. There were no creditors pressing him, no obligations left unmet. His contentment was not the passive ease of someone who had stumbled into comfort. It was the active satisfaction of a man who had worked deliberately for years toward exactly this arrangement, and the arrangement had arrived. He sat with all of this around him and felt something that requires no translation across the centuries. The specific satisfaction of a person who loves what they have built, who has arranged a life with care, and who finds on a particular evening that the arrangement holds. Nothing missing, nothing threatening. Everything he valued was present and accounted for. He spoke to the coming night, to the rains gathering on the horizon. My cattle have been tended. My rice has been cooked. My house is well thatched, and the fire burns. If you wish to reign, then reign. A wandering monk was near the same river that evening. and heard Daniya's words. He replied, verse by verse, in the same structure Daniya had used, accounting for what he had secured in the same cadence. But what the monk described bore no resemblance to cattle or stored crops or thatching. He said his mind was no longer a herd running wherever it wished, toward what it found attractive, away from what it found threatening. He said the stability he had developed required nothing external to hold it in place. He said his fire had been extinguished, the fire most people spend their lives feeding without knowing they are feeding it, the heat of requiring things to be different from what they are. He too said, if you wish to reign, then reign. The monk's replies were not cold. He was not describing withdrawal from the world or cultivated indifference to what he encountered. He ate food when food was offered. He walked roads. He met people and spoke with them at length. The difference between him and Daniya was interior and specific. His inner stability had no external load, bearing walls. He did not require any particular person to remain as they were, any particular situation to stay arranged, any particular outcome to arrive, in order for the quality of his engagement with that moment to remain undiminished. This exchange is preserved in the Sutta Nipata, one of the oldest surviving collections in the Pali Canon. Both men address the same sky. The rain that follows falls on both of them. Their fields get wet equally. The river rises for both. What differs between them is entirely interior, what each of them requires to remain arranged in order for peace to be possible. Daniya requires the cattle penned. He requires the thatching to hold. He requires the crops to stay stored and the family to remain warm. If any of those things changes, his peace changes with it, because his peace is architecturally dependent on external conditions holding their arrangement. The monk has built something the weather cannot disorganize. The difference between those two kinds of security is what the rest of tonight is about. Here is the first thing worth examining carefully. The grip that produces suffering rarely announces itself as a grip. It presents as love, loyalty, reasonable investment in what matters. It feels, from the inside, almost indistinguishable from genuine care. Daniya is not wrong to tend his cattle and thatch his house. His care for what he has built is real. His love for his family is real. What produces suffering is not the caring itself, but the architecture the caring has been built upon. Peace made structurally conditional on things remaining arranged in a way that things do not reliably remain arranged. Buddhism identifies this in its account of how suffering is maintained. Craving arises when experience is met with wanting more of the pleasant, wanting less of the unpleasant. And then something else happens. The wanting gets fed. The Pali word for this feeding is upadana, which appears in the canon's description of what keeps suffering burning. Upadana means fuel, the specific act by which the mind takes a passing experience and converts it into a held requirement. A fire left without fuel burns what it has and goes out. A fire continuously fed does not go out. Upadana is the feeding, the quiet, continuous movement of the mind that says, this pleasant experience must remain available, this arrangement must hold, this person must continue to provide what I have come to need from them. The experience itself is not the problem. Real warmth is real. Genuine love is genuine. The canon is explicit on this. The Buddha never taught that pleasure was false or that caring for people was a mistake. What he identified was the specific movement that arrives at the moment after pleasure, is encountered, the reaching. The silent agreement the mind makes with itself in the fraction of a second, that warmth is recognized. More of this. Again, this. Hold this. Here. Arrange things. So this remains available. That movement is so fast and so ordinary that most people have never noticed it as a thing separate from the pleasure itself. Any sensory experience, the canon teaches, carries 3 dimensions that the mind rarely considers separately. The first is gratification, the real warmth, the genuine pleasure, the actual satisfaction an experience brings. This is real, and the Buddha never minimized it. The joy of good company is genuine joy. The satisfaction of something beautiful encountered clearly is real satisfaction. The second dimension is danger. What happens in the mind when gratification gets converted into a requirement? When the experience is no longer simply enjoyed but demanded, when the mind has decided this must continue, that life must arrange itself so this feeling stays available, that something has gone fundamentally wrong when it is no longer present. That conversion is where suffering enters. The third dimension is the escape, a way of meeting experience that allows the gratification to be fully present without triggering the mechanism that converts it into a condition. The warmth is still warm. The love is still real. What no longer fires is the part of the mind that turns this into a requirement for peace. Most people move through life primarily inside the first dimension, frequently overwhelmed by the second, and with almost no experience of what the third actually feels like in daily practice. That third dimension is what the rest of tonight is built to illuminate. And this is where the difference between clinging and loving becomes important to understand precisely, because the two feel almost identical from the inside. Love sees what is actually present. It responds to what is genuinely there. It can be completely real in a moment, without requiring the moment to extend itself indefinitely. Clinging adds something to what is present, a demand, a quiet, persistent requirement that this person, this feeling, this arrangement must remain stable. The moment that requirement is operating beneath a relationship, perception begins to change in specific ways. The person in front of you is no longer seen fully as they actually are. They are seen through the filter of what the grip needs them to remain. Their actual complexity, the ways they are still becoming, The dimensions of them, your understanding, has not reached. The parts that have nothing to do with what your need has decided they are, gets compressed into the narrower shape of what the requirement needs them to stay. There is a paradox inside this compression. The grip is trying to hold something close, but the holding creates distance. When you can only see a person through the filter of what your requirement needs them to remain, you have placed that filter between yourself and who they actually are. You are relating not to the person, but to the version of them the grip needs. The tighter the hold, the more the thing being held recedes behind the shape of the requirement. This is what the canon means when it describes clinging as distorting perception, a description of what happens inside ordinary daily relationships, not a metaphor about some rarefied spiritual state. And when the person grows or changes or disappoints the requirement, as people will, because they are alive, and alive things change, the pain that arrives is not from the change itself. It is from the gap between the change and the grip that was insisting the change should not happen. Think of something you are carrying right now. It does not need to be dramatic. A friendship that has become slightly exhausting without any single incident explaining why. A working relationship where each interaction leaves a residue. The visible content of the interaction does not fully account for. A connection with a family member where something is perpetually being managed. Some version of the relationship maintained through continuous small adjustments. Some gap between what the relationship actually is and what the grip needs it to remain. There is likely real care inside all of that tiredness. Real history, real affection, real investment that predates the weight. The exhaustion does not come from the caring. It comes from the continuous background work of maintaining an arrangement that may have quietly moved beyond the point of matching. That background work is largely invisible because it presents itself as love. The same mechanism operates in the grip most people maintain on outcomes. The actual effort of a goal, the hours honestly given, the attention genuinely brought, rarely exhausts in the same way the anxiety running underneath does. What if it does not arrive? What if everything is done correctly and something still goes wrong? What if arrival turns out to change nothing essential? That specific quality of anxiety is the grip's signature, consuming attention that the actual work could have used, running even in moments when the part of you that is simply living your life would prefer to be fully present for what is here. And when the outcome finally arrives, the relief is real, but rarely lasts the way the grip convinced you it would. Because a mind that spent months gripping one outcome has often transferred the grip to the next before the relief of arrival has fully settled. The mechanism does not satisfy itself. It finds a new object. The fire keeps burning. The weight continues. The person carrying it cannot quite locate where the tiredness comes from, because from the inside it still looks exactly like reasonable care about things that matter. The same architecture operates in how most people relate to their own sense of self. When you hold tightly to a particular identity, the capable one, the reliable one, the person who handles difficulty with composure, the parts of your actual experience that do not fit that image begin to be treated as threats. The uncertainty you feel about a decision you assumed you should find straightforward. The grief that arrives over something you thought you were past grieving. The confusion when your actual responses diverge from the person you believe yourself to be. All of that gets managed and minimized because the grip on a consistent self-image requires inconsistency to be explained away rather than met honestly. The energy required for that management runs silently all day beneath everything else you are doing. It is often the largest single consumer of attention in a person's day. It is rarely named clearly because it looks from the inside exactly like caring about who you are. Return to Danya at his river. His cattle are real. His love for his family is real. The effort he has put into building this life is genuine and not to be dismissed. What the monk's parallel verses point toward is one specific thing: the difference between caring for what you have built and requiring what you have built to remain unchanged as the condition for your peace. The monk's stability faces the same rain and does not require it to cooperate. His extinguished fire is precise in what it means, not the warmth of genuine connection, which is still fully present in how he meets the people who come to him. It is specifically the fire of requiring experience to be other than it is, the heat that runs beneath most people's days, maintaining the constant, low-grade work of insisting on arrangements that life has not agreed to maintain. The practice that begins here is a single question, asked quietly and without self-accusation. Beneath this caring, what am I actually requiring? What version of this person or this situation is the grip insisting must stay stable? What would the caring look like if that requirement were to soften slightly? You do not need to answer fully in order for the question to do its work. Asking it clearly, with genuine curiosity rather than self-reproach, is often sufficient to begin a loosening. And a grip that has loosened slightly changes the quality of everything it was previously constricting. What you are looking for is the seam between the caring itself and the requirement running underneath the caring. They have probably been entangled long enough that separating them feels impossible, but they are distinct. You can want good things for someone without requiring them to stay a particular version of themselves. You can invest deeply in your work without requiring it to confirm something specific about your worth. You can hold your values honestly without requiring every inconsistency to be hidden before it disrupts the arrangement. These are the specific changes that happen as the grip gradually softens through practice, not as instructions followed, but as natural consequences of seeing more clearly. The person you are caring for becomes slightly more real. You notice things about them the requirement had been occupying the bandwidth for. The work you are doing carries a different quality. The effort feels more like itself and less like evidence, gathering for a verdict about your worth. The version of yourself you have been maintaining becomes less brittle. These are gradual easings, not breakthroughs, but gradual easings, sustained across time, change the texture of a life considerably. The rain came that night. It fell on both men equally, on the monk's road and on Daniya's enclosure, on what each of them had built, and on everything still outside the reach of what either of them could protect. What they each met the rain with is the whole teaching. One had prepared by securing everything he loved. One had prepared in a different way entirely. There is a question this distinction immediately produces. If I release the grip, what happens to what I love? If I stop requiring things to stay arranged, won't what I value simply drift away? This worry is so consistent that the Buddha addressed it directly in a teaching given between two monks who had never previously met, using the image of relay vehicles on a long road to show that releasing what has served its purpose is what allows the journey to continue, not what ends it. Is moral conduct the goal of this life in practice? The answer came without hesitation. Moral conduct is a vehicle. Then is purification of mind the goal? Purification of mind is a vehicle. The questioning continued through 7 stages, each offered as a possibility, each declined with the same patient precision. A vehicle, a relay post, necessary and real, and not the destination. This exchange is preserved in the Ratavinita Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, a conversation between 2 monks who had never previously met. Punnamantani and Sariputta found each other at a monastery in Savatthi, and Sariputta, who had heard remarkable things about Punna from practitioners across the community, wanted to understand precisely what this man was practicing toward. Sariputta was among the Buddha's most accomplished disciples, known for his analytical precision and the depth of his understanding. That he would sit down to question a monk he had never met with genuine curiosity rather than the authority of a senior practitioner delivering conclusions says something about what the conversation was actually for. He asked. He listened. What, after everything, was the goal? After moral discipline, after mental composure, after years of clear seeing, deepening through practice, what were all of these stages actually in service of? Punna's answer was careful and honest. Each stage is genuinely valuable, genuinely transformative, and none of them is the destination. They are vehicles, relay chariots, each built to carry you to a specific point on a long road, and each to be released there so the next vehicle can continue the journey from that post. The simile he offered is worth sitting with fully. If you needed to travel from Savatthi to Rajagaha, a considerable distance across ancient India, you would take relay vehicles at successive posts along the way. You ride the first chariot to the first relay post. There you transfer to the second, which carries you to the next. You continue through each post until you arrive. At each post, the previous chariot is released. You do not carry it forward out of loyalty to what it gave you. You do not add its weight to the load the next one must bear. You board the next vehicle. The road continues. The 7 stages Punna described, moral conduct, sense restraint, mindfulness, composure, right knowledge, liberation, are precisely this, a sequence of relay vehicles, each creating the conditions for the next to become possible, each released when those conditions have been fully established. Moral conduct creates the internal stability from which genuine composure can develop. Composure creates the settled attention through which clear seeing arises. Clear seeing erodes the specific ignorance that feeds craving. And craving released, understood clearly enough that it no longer finds fuel, is what liberation means in practical rather than abstract terms. No stage is the destination. Each is ground for the next. And ground, when it has done its work as ground, is set down. When Sariputta reported this conversation to the Buddha confirmed that Punna had answered well. He added no corrections. The exchange stood as a complete account of how the path unfolds. This confirmation settles a question the relay chariot simile immediately raises. Is it possible to skip a relay post? To board a later vehicle without the earlier one having done its work? The answer is no. The sequence is not arbitrary. Each vehicle creates the road conditions the next one requires. You cannot take the 6th chariot from Savatthi. It is not there yet. This teaching describes the arc of Buddhist practice. It describes equally how significant change in any life actually works, and why so many of those changes feel like loss when they are not. Giving up comes from exhaustion and despair. The vehicle still has road ahead of it, but the energy or belief required to keep moving has collapsed. Giving up does not read the relay post correctly. It concludes the post is the edge of the road rather than a transfer point on it. It collapses the journey. The person who gives up and the person who genuinely lets go may perform the same outward act at the same moment. Both release the grip. What differs is what generated the release and what follows from it. Letting go is a different movement. It comes from recognizing that a particular vehicle has genuinely reached its post, that what it was built to carry you through has been carried through, and that the next stage requires something the current vehicle cannot provide. The grief that accompanies this recognition is real. The loss is real. What shifts is what the grief is evidence of. It is evidence that something genuine has completed, and something that has completed is not the same as something that has been taken from you. The canon has a specific word for the quality of relinquishment the relay chariot teaching points toward: Vossaga. It appears repeatedly in the Pali canon in connection with liberation, not as passive resignation, but as an active interior movement. The willingness to release what has done its work, cleanly and completely, so that nothing from the previous stage is dragged forward, as unnecessary weight. Vasaga is not giving up. It is the courageous act of a person who has understood clearly enough to release deliberately rather than grip exhaustedly. What Vasaga is not also matters. It is not suppression, the forced burying of something that still has energy in it. A person practicing Vasaga can grieve fully, can feel the weight of what is releasing, can honor what the vehicle carried them through, and still know with clarity that the post has been reached. The grief and the release do not contradict each other. They occur simultaneously. Both are honest. The difficulty at the relay post is specific and worth naming plainly. The current vehicle is familiar. You understand its dimensions, how it handles on difficult terrain, what it requires of you in hard moments. You have invested genuine time, learning to use it well. The next vehicle has not yet appeared clearly enough to justify stepping off. The relay post therefore feels, from one angle, like a cliff edge rather than a transfer station, because what comes next is not visible from the middle of the previous run. This is the gap most people fall into. The current vehicle is clearly not moving forward, but the next one has not yet become visible, so the grip tightens on what is no longer working. The alternative has not yet been seen. Knowing whether a vehicle has genuinely reached its post, or whether you are simply tired, requires honesty about what kind of effort is still available. When a vehicle is genuinely complete, effort applied to it produces a particular quality of futility. The effort is real, but nothing is moving, and more effort does not change that. When a vehicle still has road but the traveler is exhausted, rest and the return of energy resume progress. The distinction between these two is felt rather than calculated, which is precisely why the honest self-observation the practice cultivates is not optional. It is the instrument for reading the post correctly. The Rathavanita Sutta is precise on what happens at the post. The next vehicle appears when you arrive and stop. It becomes visible when you step off, when the previous vehicle is released, when you are standing at the post with open hands. The appearance of what comes next is conditioned on the genuine release of what was. This is not a promise about what will arrive. It is a description of what the next vehicle requires in order to be visible at all. What practitioners do in the gap between vehicles matters. The canon describes a quality of attention appropriate for this interval: patient abiding, staying with what is present without demanding that what comes next arrive on a particular schedule. The gap is not a failure of practice. It is the interval during which conditions for the next stage are still gathering. Forcing movement before those conditions are ready produces the kind of effort that exhausts without progress. The difference between pushing a door that opens inward and simply waiting for it to swing. The gap is not empty time. It is time in which the traveler adjusts to what they have just released, and in which the new road becomes slowly visible. Staying with that process, honestly, without urgency, without performing readiness before it has arrived, is itself a practice. Consider the identities most people carry into the middle years of a life. A version of yourself built to navigate specific demands, the demands of early career, of a long relationship, of a decade organized around particular forms of striving, does not remain the right vehicle indefinitely. The strategies that carried you well through one decade can genuinely constrain what becomes possible in the next. When this begins happening, the mind registers it as friction. Familiar approaches feel misaligned. Old patterns produce diminishing returns. Something feels contained in ways that have no obvious source. From inside that friction, the situation presents as a problem to diagnose. From the relay chariot view, it looks simpler. The vehicle has reached its post. What is being asked is a transfer. The friction is the post announcing itself. This applies equally to the conclusions most people carry about themselves. The interpretation of a painful event that became a fixed belief about your own capacity. The story built from a pattern of difficulty that hardened into a permanent verdict: I am the kind of person who cannot do this. These conclusions were relay vehicles too, built to make sense of specific experiences at a specific time, useful then in making conditions navigable. When carried far past the experience that generated them, they become the most constraining vehicles of all. Ones the passenger has completely forgotten are vehicles, having mistaken them for the road itself. The same logic applies to fixed views of other people. The interpretation of a difficult person formed during a period of genuine hurt that hardened into a permanent category. The verdict about a family member or colleague that was accurate at a specific moment and is now simply carried forward by habit. People change. The person being encountered through the lens of an old conclusion may be genuinely different from the one who occasioned it. The vehicle served a purpose at the time. When carried past the experience that generated it, it prevents seeing what is actually present, and contact with another person becomes contact with an old story about them. The same structure operates in relationships that have run their full course. Every relationship does specific work. It creates conditions for particular kinds of growth, carries each person through terrain, the connection alone made traversable. When that work is complete, when both people have grown in the directions this connection made possible and are now moving in directions that require different conditions, holding the relationship in its previous form through determined, attachment produces the distortion described in the first section. The person in front of you is no longer seen as they actually are. They are compressed into the shape of what the grip needs them to remain. Releasing the grip at the relay post is an act of honesty toward both people, an acknowledgement that what was given was real, that the crossing it enabled was real, and that what is being asked now is a transfer. The love was the crossing. The love does not end when the chariot is released. What ends is the specific form the vehicle had taken. there is a paradox inside, clinging, that the relay post makes visible. The grip that refuses to release what has completed its work does not preserve what it is gripping. A connection held past its genuine course by force of attachment becomes rigid, then resentful, then something neither person recognizes as what they were trying to preserve. The tighter the hold on what wants to complete, the further the actual thing recedes. What the grip is holding by the end is not the connection. It is the shape of the requirement that the connection continue. These are not the same thing, and mistaking one for the other is where considerable suffering lives. The same paradox appears in creative work and long projects. The approach that produced genuine results in the early stages of building something can become the primary obstacle to what the work needs to become next. Artists and practitioners encounter this. The method that opened the first door, carried faithfully forward past the door it opened, blocks the second. Releasing a method that worked is how the work continues. The far bank requires different movement than the near one did. The Buddha extended this logic to his own teaching, explicitly. In the Alagadupama Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, he compared the entire body of his teaching to a raft. A person uses a raft to cross a flood. On reaching the far bank, they face a question: should they lift the raft onto their shoulders and carry it forward? The raft was for crossing. The crossing is complete. It is left at the water's edge. He was speaking about his own teaching deliberately. The Dhamma is taught for the purpose of crossing over, not for the purpose of holding on. Even genuine wisdom, carried as a possession rather than used as a vehicle, becomes weight the carrier did not need. Sariputta received all of this from Punna, in the quality of attention that arrives when a teaching meets a question already moving inside you. His final question was the most precise. What is the goal, if none of the 7 stages is it? Punna answered without elaboration: complete liberation without clinging. Liberation that holds nothing, not the stages that produced it, not the teaching that pointed toward it, not even the relief of having arrived. The raft left at the bank, the chariot at the final post, hands open. When something in your own life is ending, a role, a phase, a version of yourself you have inhabited with genuine care, one question is worth pausing for honestly. Has this vehicle reached its post? Has it done what it came to do? Is what you are grieving the grief of something forcibly taken, or the grief of something complete being mistaken for something broken? These questions do not demand quick answers. They do not require resolution before movement is possible. Holding them with genuine curiosity, without urgency, changes what an ending means over time. It transforms gradually from something that happened to you into something that completed, and from something that completed into ground for what follows. The next vehicle was waiting at every one of those posts. It could not be seen from the middle of the previous run. It never can. What you are ready to release tonight is already pointing toward what comes next. What remains, though, is a question the relay chariot teaching does not fully resolve, the one that resists this frame most stubbornly. What about the pain that did not feel like a relay post at all? The loss that arrived not from a vehicle completing its work, but from something disrupted before it was done? A wandering ascetic brought exactly this question to the Buddha in precise form, and the answer he received is one of the most practically relieving passages in the entire Pali Canon. There is a belief that most people carry without having given it a name. When something painful arrives, illness, loss, a period of life that grinds without obvious end, the mind produces, quietly and almost automatically, a verdict about it. Something must have been done to deserve this. A better person would not be experiencing this. If the right causes had been planted, this particular difficulty would not have come. The suffering itself becomes evidence of something deficient in the one suffering. This belief rarely announces itself clearly. It runs beneath conscious thought as a persistent undertone, the sense that what arrives in a life reflects, with some precision, what has been morally generated. In traditions that use the word karma, the belief wears that vocabulary. In secular life, it wears different words. Everything happens for a reason. You attract what you project. The universe delivers what you have sent out. The vocabulary differs. The underlying structure is identical. What comes to me reflects who I have been, and what I am suffering is therefore appropriate to the person I am. The wandering ascetic who came to the Buddha had been taught a rigorous, philosophically developed version of this belief, and he did something that required genuine intellectual honesty. He asked whether it was correct. His name was Mulia Sivaka. He was not a Buddhist practitioner. He belonged to another tradition, trained in its methods and committed to its understanding of causation. The understanding he carried was this: everything a person experiences, every illness, every accident, every loss that arrives without a visible external cause is the fruit of past intentional action. You generated the causes of your experience in this life or across previous ones. The ledger is precise. What comes to you is what you set in motion, all of it, without exception. The Buddha's answer was no. Not no softened by enough qualification to leave the original view standing. Not no accompanied by diplomatic acknowledgement that the questioner's tradition had a point worth considering. No as a clean, direct disagreement with a specific claim, followed immediately by what actually generates experience. 8 distinct causes, each real, each operating independently, and only one of which is karma. He named them in sequence. Bile, the body's digestive processes, when imbalanced, produce heat and inflammation and a range of physical suffering that has nothing to do with the moral history of the person experiencing it. Phlegm, another bodily process whose imbalance generates illness through physical rather than karmic mechanisms. Wind, conditions affecting the nervous system and the physical energy available to the body. Combinations of these three, producing more complex conditions than any single cause alone generates. Seasonal changes, the body's response to heat and cold, and the transitions between them, which create conditions for certain kinds of suffering regardless of the quality of intention the body's inhabitant has been cultivating. Careless behavior, actions taken without adequate attention to one's own physical well-being, which produce predictable physical consequences, not karmic consequence, in the moral sense, simply the direct result of insufficient care applied to a physical body. External assault, harm that arrives from outside through violence, accident, or circumstances that impinge on a body from forces entirely external to it. And karma, intentional action and its fruits, the eighth cause, real and consequential, and one of eight, rather than the single explanation for all the others combined. To say that all experience is past karma, the Buddha told Sivaka, is wrong view. That language was precise in its context. Wrong view, the specific category of misunderstanding that distorts everything downstream of it by getting the foundational picture incorrect. The wise, he concluded, reject this attribution. The rain falls because of atmospheric conditions. The infection arrives because a body encountered a pathogen under conditions that allowed it to take hold. Neither event consults the moral record of the person caught in it. The practical weight of this wrong view is most visible in chronic suffering, the pain that does not resolve in weeks or months, but becomes the texture of a life over years. When chronic illness, persistent grief, or long difficulty is filtered through the all-karma lens, the suffering doubles in a specific way. The illness or difficulty is the first layer. The continuous low-grade trial of the self, examining what past action could have generated this, wondering what moral correction might eventually relieve it, becomes a second layer of effort stretched across every day. The condition persists. The Sivaka teaching lifts that second layer entirely for the portion of the difficulty that is genuinely impersonal. The first layer remains. The second layer loses its basis. This exchange sits in the Sayutta Nikaya, one of the central collections of the Pali Canon. The sutta is brief. The Buddha answered clearly and did not elaborate beyond what the question required. That brevity carries something itself. This is not a subtle or contested point requiring extended philosophical treatment. It is a correction offered plainly to someone who asked honestly. The precision of the Buddha's reply to Sivaka reflects how he generally handled wrong views that carried identifiable practical consequences. He did not target abstract philosophical errors as such. He corrected beliefs that produced suffering, beliefs that narrowed compassion, that compounded difficulty with verdict, that generated second arrows from misunderstanding rather than from direct experience. The all-karma attribution belonged in this category not because it was philosophically inelegant, but because of what it produced in the people who held it and in their relationships with those around them who were suffering. What the correction releases is the second arrow, the two-arrow, teaching names. The first arrow is the pain itself, the illness, the loss, the circumstance that grinds without obvious resolution. The first arrow arrives through whatever combination of the 8 causes is operating at that moment. It is real and it hurts. The second arrow is what the mind shoots at itself in response. The verdict that a person of better moral standing would not be experiencing this. The conclusion that this reflects karmic appropriateness, the quiet prosecution of the self for having generated what has arrived. The first arrow may be unavoidable. The second arrow is generated specifically by the wrong view the Buddha named to Sivaka. Remove the wrong view, and the second arrow loses its basis. The first arrow remains. The suffering compounded on top of it by incorrect attribution does not. The Buddha defined karma in the Anguttara Nikaya with precision that the Sivaka teaching depends on. Karma is cetana, intention. Intentional action through body, speech, and mind. What is deliberately done and said and brought to choices, and the conditions those intentions and actions create over time in the quality of relationships and circumstances that intentional behavior shapes. The fruits karma produces also operate across considerably longer timescales than a single experience arriving in a day or a week. The canon teaches that karma ripens when conditions align, not on the schedule the mind expects, not in neat correspondence with recent action, and often in ways that are not legible as obvious consequences of obvious causes. This is part of why using karma as a live tracking system for daily experience produces distorted results. Even karma that is genuinely yours does not operate with the immediacy and directness the all karma attribution implicitly assumes. Causes are planted, and conditions for their ripening develop across long stretches of time through processes that cannot be monitored from the inside. This is what karma means in the canon: intentional action and its fruits. That definition locates what you are actually responsible for, the quality of your intentions, the actions they generate, the conditions those actions are building over time, and places everything else where it belongs. The suffering generated by bile or seasonal change or external assault does not belong in your moral ledger. It belongs in the other 7 categories, which operate through their own mechanisms, independent of your intentional field. None of this removes karma from the picture. The karma that is genuinely yours, the patterns of intention you bring to your choices, the actions those intentions generate, the conditions those actions are accumulating across time, is real and consequential and deserves careful, honest attention. Acknowledging it is not self-punishment. It is accurate accounting that makes genuine change possible. Using the Sivaka teaching to avoid the slice of karma that actually belongs to you would be using it precisely backwards. There is something the teaching clarifies about compassion as well. When another person is suffering, through illness, through poverty, through circumstances that persist without obvious resolution, the all-karma attribution generates a specific quality of justified distance. They must have earned this through past action. This is their karmic situation, completing its necessary process. This reasoning has been used across many contexts and centuries to justify the withdrawal of practical help from people who needed it. It rests on the wrong view Sivaka came to test. This misattribution also shapes how people speak to those who are suffering, and the shape it produces is worth naming. When a person in pain hears, in whatever vocabulary it arrives, that their suffering reflects what they have generated, the suffering is compounded by shame. The first arrow hurts. The message that it is morally appropriate adds a specific quality of isolation. This is mine, in a way that cannot be shared or relieved by another person's presence. The Sivaka teaching recovers the actual function of presence. When suffering has impersonal causes, another person sitting with that suffering in honest acknowledgement is not an irrelevance. It is medicine. The 8 causes operate simultaneously and do not suspend each other's operation. A person who has cultivated carefully considered intentions across years still catches diseases through pathogen exposure, still encounters seasonal change and the conditions it creates, still meets external circumstances that arrive through forces entirely outside their intentional field. What practice changes is not the operation of the other 7 causes. What practice changes is the quality of what is available in the mind when those causes produce their effects. A mind that has worked with releasing upadana meets difficulty with less of the second arrow added on top. The difficulty is real, the suffering compounded by attributing it to karmic deservingness is substantially reduced. That reduction is not small. There is a discomfort that sometimes arrives with the Sivaka teaching on first encounter. The belief that everything is karma carries, alongside its suffering, a form of psychological security. If I generated all of this, then I can also uncreate it through better action. If the ledger responds to my moral choices, then improving my choices will eventually change what arrives. The all-karma attribution is painful, but it is pain inside a framework that preserves the sense of fundamental control. Everything is organized around me and what I have done. The Sivaka teaching removes that security in one specific domain. Some of what arrives in a life is simply impersonal, physical, environmental, circumstantial, and does not respond to moral improvement because it was never organized around moral deservingness to begin with. Accepting this fully requires a different relationship with uncertainty than the all-karma view permits. It requires meeting difficulty without a narrative that explains precisely why. it is happening. This is precisely the capacity that working with upadana develops over time. A mind practicing the release of its grip on required outcomes is also developing the capacity to meet impersonal difficulty without demanding moral organization from it. Releasing the requirement that life arrange itself in particular ways includes releasing the requirement that suffering carry a moral explanation. Both are forms of meeting what is actually present without adding what is not there. One of the quieter gifts the Sivaka teaching offers is the recognition that what is impersonal is not hostile. Bile does not dislike you. Seasonal change is not organized against your well-being. The external circumstances that arrive through ecological or economic forces are not a message. They are conditions arising through their own causes, operating through their own mechanisms, producing effects in the bodies and lives they encounter without any orientation toward the individuals they happen to reach. That impersonality is different from the impersonality of being overlooked or forgotten. It is the impersonality of how physical and circumstantial reality operates, thoroughly, without malice, without preference, and without any reference to whether the person it is reaching has been careful in their intentions or not. Meeting that impersonality clearly, without narrating it as punishment, without demanding the moral organization it does not contain, changes something in how difficulty lands. The second arrow does not fire. What remains is the first arrow only, real, present, and workable, without the additional weight of verdict layered on top. Sivaka left that conversation with a more accurate picture than he arrived with. What he lost was the simplicity of a single explanatory frame. What he gained was an account that matched how experience actually works. Complex, multi-causal, not organized around the moral deservingness of whoever is experiencing it at any given moment. You can work carefully and honestly with the karma that is genuinely yours, the quality of intention behind what you say, what you do, how you meet the people and circumstances of your life, and simultaneously release the weight of believing yourself the sole author of every difficulty that has arrived. One keeps you responsible for what is actually in your domain. The other releases what was never yours to carry. Both are necessary. Neither alone produces what the Sivaka teaching is pointing toward. An accurate picture, held clearly, without additional suffering, generated by getting the proportions wrong. Something still sits underneath all of this. A question both the relay chariot teaching and the Sivaka teaching have been approaching from different angles without fully closing. If clinging produces one kind of weight and impersonal causes produce another, what does genuine steadiness look like in a person who has met both truths honestly? An acrobat and his apprentice stood beside a tall pole and disagreed about the answer to that question. And when the Buddha heard the disagreement, he sided immediately with the younger one. The the disagreement was simple enough that it could have been resolved in a sentence, and yet neither of them could resolve it. The master had a view, and the view made obvious sense from where he stood. The apprentice had a different view, and that one also made sense from where she stood. Both were standing at the base of a tall pole they were about to climb, and the question between them was straightforward. Once they were up there, moving through the performance, how would they best keep each other safe? The master, acrobat, had performed for years. He knew precisely what it cost when attention wandered at height. He had watched other performers lose their footing, had felt himself lose concentration in moments of distraction, and recovered only narrowly. His view came from experience. If each of them watched the other, monitoring the other's balance and position, and any sign of instability developing, they could catch problems the other person could not catch themselves, and both would be protected. The care was genuine. He was trying to look after them both. His apprentice listened, and then disagreed. Her view was this: you watch yourself, and I will watch myself. When each of us maintains our own balance with full attention, both of us are protected. That is the condition that keeps us both safe. Not the monitoring of the other, but the complete quality of care each brings to their own footing, their own balance, their own position on the pole at every moment of the performance. The master thought her answer was a mistake. She thought his was. Neither persuaded the other. The Buddha heard this disagreement and was asked to resolve it. He confirmed, without qualification, that the apprentice was right. He then extended the teaching beyond the immediate question of acrobatics into one of the most important passages in the Samyutta Nikaya. By protecting oneself, one protects others. By protecting others, one protects oneself. Both directions were real, both genuinely operated, and the order in which they were stated was not incidental. Self-protection was named first. The outward movement was named second. Not because the other person's well-being mattered less, but because the sequence had an actual structure that doing it backwards could not replicate. This sutta, the Siddhaka Sutta, preserved in the Samyutta Nikaya's section on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, arrives at exactly the juncture in tonight's teaching where the previous 3 sections have been building toward it. The first section named what clinging costs in the quality of perception and presence. The second named the difference between releasing what has completed its work and collapsing in exhaustion. The third removed the weight of believing yourself the moral author of every difficulty that has arrived. All 3 of those teachings are internal movements, work done inside the mind and inside one's relationship to experience. This section names why that internal work is not self-absorption. It is the condition for anything genuine to move outward from you. The master acrobat's view contains a failure of logic that becomes visible only when the pole's specific demands are examined carefully. A performer at height, monitoring another performer's balance, is dividing the attention required for their own balance. Some portion of awareness is tracking the other person's position rather than their own. In a ground-level activity, this division might be sustainable. On the pole, it creates exactly the vulnerability it is trying to prevent. The attempt to protect the other person by watching them produces instability in the one doing the watching. Two people monitoring each other are two people with divided attention. Two people monitoring themselves are two people fully stable. The second arrangement produces better outcomes for both, not despite the fact that each is focused on themselves, but because of it. The Buddha expanded this logic into a framework that touches every form of relationship. The four foundations of mindfulness, the practice of attending to the body, to feeling tones, to the quality of mind, and to the arising of mental objects, are, in this teaching, described as the instrument of self-protection. A practitioner attending carefully to their own experience, noticing what is arising, catching the movement from feeling tone into craving before it has fully fired, working with their own patterns with the quality of honest attention that practice develops. This person is not retreating from the world. They are producing the stability that makes any genuine contribution to the world possible. The Buddha named two specific ways protection moves in both directions simultaneously. Self-protection through mindfulness, the careful tending of one's own inner ground, protects others because a mind that has worked with its own instabilities becomes a steadier presence in every encounter. The person who has sat with their own anger long enough to understand its arising does not discharge it onto others without recognition. The person who has worked with their own grief meets another person's grief with genuine presence rather than managed distance. The person who has released some portion of their grip on required outcomes does not bring that requirement into their relationships as an unacknowledged pressure. The second direction operates equally. Protecting others through patience, through non-harming, through compassion and equanimity in how one meets the people encountered in a day, develops the very qualities of mind that constitute self-protection. The practice of patience with another person's difficulty is the same practice as patience with one's own. The cultivation of non-harming as a consistent orientation protects the practitioner from the specific category of karmic consequence that harmful action sets in motion. The two movements are not separate projects running in parallel. They are the same project viewed from two angles. What the master acrobat had missed is what most people miss when they believe that genuine care for others requires directing their attention outward rather than attending to their own ground. The misunderstanding is understandable. Caring about another person feels like it should mean watching them, monitoring them, tracking their condition, and responding to every change in it. The attention flows toward the other. This is what love looks like from the inside when it is active and concerned. But a person whose attention is primarily organized around monitoring another's state is a person whose own state is being attended to by no one. And a person whose own ground is unattended becomes unreliable in ways that damage exactly the relationship they are trying to protect. Section 3, named How Suffering Compounded on Top of the First Arrow, arrives through incorrect attribution. The same structure appears in relationships where one person organizes their own stability almost entirely around the condition of another. When the other person's state is the primary reference point for one's own equilibrium, the first person's well-being becomes hostage to something they cannot actually control. The anxiety this produces is real and runs continuously beneath the surface of the relationship. It looks like care. From the pole's perspective, it is the divided attention that produces instability in both. The Siddhaka Sutta sits within the section of the Samyutta Nikaya dedicated to the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and that placement is not incidental. The Buddha was teaching about what the 4 foundations actually accomplish, not only in meditation on a cushion, but in daily contact with other people and circumstances. A practitioner maintaining the 4 foundations, attending to body, feeling tone, mind state, and mental objects as they actually are in this moment, is performing exactly the apprentice's function. Each moment is met from a position of genuine internal reference, rather than from the instability of an attention divided between oneself and the monitoring of external conditions one cannot control. This has a direct application to the exhaustion most people describe in relationships that are genuinely meaningful to them. The exhaustion rarely comes from the love itself. It comes from a specific allocation of attention, the continuous tracking of the other person's state, the monitoring of their signals, the quiet labor of adjusting oneself to whatever is being read from them in any given moment. That labor consumes attention that the relationship itself does not require and cannot use. The other person does not benefit from being monitored at that level of continuous intensity. They benefit from being met by someone who is genuinely present and genuinely stable, someone on whose footing they can rely, because that footing is being tended honestly. The permission this teaching extends is specific and should be received as such. Attending to your own ground, your own patterns, your own reactions, your own relationship to what arises in you is not a retreat from responsibility toward the people who matter to you. It is the specific form that responsibility takes when understood clearly. A person who cannot meet their own fear will not be able to sit with another person's fear without flinching away from it or attempting to resolve it prematurely. A person who has no relationship with their own grief will manage rather than accompany another person's grieving. A person who has not worked with their own anger will discharge it sideways in ways they do not fully register. The apprentice's answer is not a teaching about self-sufficiency in the sense of needing nothing from anyone. The pole the acrobat performs on requires both performers. The performance is shared. The relationship between them is genuine and mutual. What the apprentice names is not a withdrawal from that relationship, but a precise account of what makes it possible for the relationship to hold. Both stable, both attending, both bringing their full quality of presence to what they are doing, which is, in the nature of a shared performance on a pole at height, also what they are doing with each other. There is a question this teaching regularly produces that deserves an honest answer. What about genuine emergencies? The moments when another person is in real difficulty, when something has gone wrong for them that they cannot address alone. The answer is that a practitioner who has maintained their own stability is the person most capable of meeting genuine emergency with genuine usefulness. They are not managing their own anxiety about the other person's difficulty at the same time as trying to help. They are not bringing their own unprocessed fear into a situation that already contains enough. Their inner ground is stable enough that the full quality of their attention can go to what is actually needed, rather than to managing the disturbance the situation creates in them. The well-tended practitioner is a better presence in genuine difficulty, not a less responsive one. The Saddaka Sutta also touches something the previous sections prepared the ground for without stating directly. The work of releasing upadana, the grip on required outcomes, on required versions of people and situations, is itself an act of self-protection in the canonical sense. A mind working honestly with its own clinging is tending its own footing. It is doing the apprentice's work, and a mind doing that work becomes progressively less likely to project its unexamined requirements onto the people around it, which is itself a form of protection offered to those people without being consciously directed at them. The relationship between the internal practice and the protection of others operates through exactly this mechanism, not through directing attention outward, but through reducing the specific ways the unexamined interior disturbs those in contact with it. The master acrobat was not wrong to care about his apprentice's safety. He was wrong about the most effective mechanism for protecting it. The same misunderstanding operates in how most people approach the question of how to be genuinely good to the people they love. The belief that care requires primarily outward direction of attention, monitoring, and management, rather than the unglamorous internal work of maintaining one's own footing as the precondition for anything reliably good to move outward from you. The Buddha's confirmation of the apprentice's view arrived without extended elaboration because the logic did not require it. The pole makes the argument visible in a form that cannot be talked around. Two people at height, one attending to the other's balance while their own drifts. The outcome is predictable. Two people at height, each attending to their own balance with complete honesty. This is the condition under which the performance can proceed, the relationship can hold, and whatever is being built together between them has ground solid enough to be built on. What comes next is a question the acrobat sutta opens rather than closes. If attending to one's own ground is the foundation, what does that ground actually feel like when it has been developed? What is the interior quality of a person who has genuinely worked with clinging, who has released what was never theirs to carry, and who has maintained honest attention to their own footing across time? A monk made a choice about where to go that answered this question more clearly than any description could, and his conversation before leaving about what steadiness actually feels like from the inside is where the next teaching begins. He chose to go there. That detail matters, and it is the first thing worth holding clearly before the conversation itself begins. Punna was not assigned to Sunaparanta, not asked by the community, not traveling through it on the way to somewhere else. He had heard about the region, had considered it, and had decided that this was where he wanted to take the teaching. He came to the Buddha to ask for his blessing on the plan. Sunaparanta's reputation was specific and consistent across the accounts that reached the central monasteries. The people there were rough. They were quick to anger and slow to soften. Travelers who had passed through brought back the same description. This was not a region where a wandering monk would find easy welcome or courteous audiences. It was not a destination anyone chose for comfort. The Buddha did not refuse Punna's request outright. He asked a question: "What will you do if the people of Sunaparanta abuse you with verbal insults?" Punna answered without hesitation. He would consider himself fortunate that they had not thrown anything at him. The Buddha asked, "And if they do throw things at you?" "Fortunate," Punna said, "that they did not use weapons." The Buddha continued, "And if they use weapons?" "Fortunate," Punna said, "that they did not take his life." "And if they kill you?" Punna's final answer was measured and genuine. He would be grateful. Other people have required poison or a blade to end their suffering. He was freed without such trouble. The Buddha gave his blessing immediately. He told Punna he could go. A practitioner of such patience and gentleness was fit for the people of Sunaparanta. The sutta records that Punna went, spent a single rainy season there, and brought 500 people to take refuge in the 3 jewels before the rains had ended. This exchange is preserved in the Sayyutta Nikaya, in the section dealing with the 6 sense bases. It is brief in the way that precisely targeted teachings tend to be brief. The teaching is complete in the conversation itself, without extensive elaboration required. What it demonstrates is not abstract, and not the product of exceptional character, available only to rare individuals. It is a specific quality of mind that the practice is designed to produce, recognizable and describable, visible in the concrete particulars of how Punna answered the Buddha's questions. The quality has a name in the canon. Upekkha, equanimity, is the 4th of the 4 Brahmaviharas: loving, kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. It is frequently misread as the least warm of the four, the one that arrives after compassion has been fully developed and involves a kind of standing back from what compassion moves toward. A cooler quality, more distant, more controlled. This reading mistakes what upekkha actually is, and Punna's answers to the Buddha's questions correct the mistake directly. Consider what Punna's responses did not contain. They did not contain bravado, the performed fearlessness of someone determined to appear unshaken. They did not contain resignation, the flat acceptance of someone who has stopped caring what happens to them. They did not contain spiritual performance, the careful enactment of the equanimous monk for an audience of one who happened to be the Buddha himself. Each answer had the texture of someone describing, accurately and without drama, what would actually arise in them in the scenario being described. Gratitude, genuine, specific, grounded gratitude at each increment of difficulty, not because the difficulty was desirable, but because each level of it had left something intact that a worse version of the same situation would not have left. This is the quality that distinguishes upekkha from its common misreadings. Apathy says, "This does not affect me because I have stopped caring." Resignation says, "I cannot change this, so I accept it by flattening my response to it." Upekkha says something different. I can be affected by this fully and honestly, and the being affected does not destabilize the ground I am standing on. The difference is interior and specific. It is the difference between a tree that does not move because it is dead and a tree that bends in strong wind because it is rooted well enough to bend without breaking. Punna was not planning to feel nothing if the people of Sunaparanta insulted or harmed him. He was describing a quality of ground that would remain available to him regardless of what they did. The Brahmaviharas as a set illuminate this further. Metta, loving kindness, is the active wish for beings to be well, extended without conditions toward whatever is encountered. Karuna, compassion, is the movement towards suffering, the wish for its relief, the willingness to remain present with difficulty rather than managing it from a careful distance. Mudita, sympathetic joy, is the genuine pleasure taken in another being's flourishing, free from the comparative diminishment that joy in another's good fortune can trigger in an unexamined mind. Upekkha is not the replacement of these three. It is the stable ground from which they operate without burning out. A practitioner extending metta without upekkha becomes vulnerable to the fluctuations of what they are extending it toward. When the beings they are wishing well respond with hostility or indifference, the metta collapses or converts into its near enemy, the attachment that is performing warmth but requires warmth in return. Karuna without upekkha converts into what the canon calls its near enemy, grief. The practitioner drowns in the suffering they move toward, rather than remaining present and useful within it. mudita without upekkha tips toward its near enemy, the excitement that is contingent on the flourishing continuing and destabilizes when the flourishing passes. Upekkha provides the root system. The other three can move fully into their respective territories: warmth, presence with suffering, joy at flourishing, because the ground they are moving from is not destabilized by what they encounter there. Punna's responses to the Buddha showed this in miniature. At each increment of hypothetical difficulty, what remained was not the narrowing of care into self-protection, but the specific quality of gratitude that his genuine orientation toward those people produced. He still wanted to be there. He still intended to offer what he had come to offer. The escalating difficulty in the scenario did not erode that orientation because the orientation was not dependent on the difficulty being absent. This is what the previous section's teaching about the acrobat's pole was building toward. Attending to one's own ground is not the destination. It is what makes the destination reachable. The quality of ground that Punna had developed through years of practice is what the apprentice's careful self-monitoring produces across time, a footing stable enough that genuine encounter with difficult people and circumstances does not require withdrawal in order to remain upright. It is worth asking what specifically upekkha is not dependent on, because this defines it more precisely than any positive description can. It is not dependent on being received warmly. Punna did not require the people of Sunaparanta to welcome him before his equanimity could be sustained. The welcome would have been good. Its absence would not change the quality of what he brought. Upekkha is not dependent on circumstances remaining manageable. Each of the Buddha's questions named a scenario worse than the previous one, and Punna's equanimity survived the full sequence without requiring the sequence to stop somewhere tolerable. It is not dependent on outcomes going as intended. He went to Sunaparanta without knowing whether his time there would produce anything. He went because the orientation that carried him there was not contingent on results confirming it. What upekkha is dependent on is equally worth naming. It depends on honest practice with one's own mental ground over time. Punna did not arrive at those answers to the Buddha's questions through exceptional, natural temperament. The canon does not describe him as unusually placid by character. The quality he displayed was produced through years of attending to what arose in him, working honestly with his own reactions, and developing the specific kind of rootedness that does not arrive through intellectual understanding of impermanence, but through repeated, direct experience of meeting difficulty without the grip tightening around it. The modern world has a particular relationship with equanimity that tends toward the misreading the canon is correcting. It is associated with wellness practices and a specific aesthetic: the calm voice, the unhurried manner, the appearance of someone who has moved beyond being substantially disturbed by anything. This is the apathy misreading wearing therapeutic clothing. The person performing equanimity and the person who has developed it are, from the outside, sometimes indistinguishable. The performance involves managing what appears on the surface, The genuine quality involves something different in the interior, not a managed surface, but a different relationship between what arises and what it finds to attach to. Punna's answers were not performed calm. They were descriptively accurate accounts of what would actually arise. He was not suppressing the recognition that insults would sting or that violence would hurt. He was describing a genuine interior orientation in which the sting and the hurt would not produce the specific reactive sequence that ends in retaliation, resentment, or the decision to withdraw and protect. The feeling would arise. The root would hold. What followed from the feeling would be the same warmth and patience that he had carried into the encounter before anything difficult happened. The Sayutta Nikaya's placement of this sutta in the section on the 6 sense bases is precise in the way the canon's organizational choices tend to be precise. The 6 sense bases, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, are the points at which experience enters. Contact at any of these bases produces a feeling tone, pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. From feeling tone, the untrained mind moves automatically into craving or aversion. The practice described across the Brahmaviharas is, at the level of sense base and feeling tone, the development of a quality of ground that does not fire automatically into that reactive sequence. Contact still happens. Feeling tone still arises. What changes is what the feeling tone finds when it arrives. A mind rooted enough that the feeling completes its natural arc without triggering the sequence of grasping or pushing away. Punna's equanimity was alive in the precise sense that it was actively oriented towards something. He wanted to be in Sunaparanta. He wanted to offer what he had come to offer. The equanimity was not a withdrawal from wanting. It was the stable ground from which the wanting could remain consistent, regardless of what it encountered. This is the distinction that separates upekkha from both apathy and resignation with the most precision. It does not require the object of care to be easy, responsive, or rewarding. The care continues. The orientation holds. The ground remains. There is something the Punavada Sutta records that is easy to overlook in focus on the conversation itself. Punna went. The blessing was given, and he traveled to Sunaparanta, and the people there were reached. 500 of them took refuge in the 3 jewels in a single rainy season. This outcome is not incidental to the teaching. It demonstrates what the canon consistently points toward, that the quality of ground a practitioner has developed is not sealed inside them, available only for private contemplation. It moves outward through every encounter, through the specific way a person with deep roots meets difficulty without hardening or withdrawing, and through the effect that quality of meeting has on the people encountered. The people of Sunaparanta had presumably met enough practitioners who managed their own discomfort by managing their distance from difficulty. What they met in Punna was someone whose warmth was not contingent on their cooperation, whose patience was not a form of suppressed irritation waiting for a threshold to be crossed, and whose presence communicated something about the teaching that no amount of doctrinal instruction could communicate as effectively. A person genuinely rooted is recognizable, even by people who have no framework for describing what they are recognizing. Something in the encounter registers as trustworthy in a way that managed warmth does not. Equanimity developed through practice does not make a person less present. It makes them more present because the attention that was previously consumed in managing one's own reactivity, bracing for difficulty, monitoring for signs that the situation was about to become uncomfortable, preparing responses to scenarios that had not yet arrived, becomes available for what is actually happening in the encounter as it unfolds. Punna could attend fully to the people of Sunaparanta because he was not simultaneously attending to his own need for the encounter to go well. He had already made peace with all the ways it might not go well, precisely and specifically, in his conversation with the Buddha. That preparation was not managed detachment. It was honest reckoning conducted in advance that freed the encounter itself from having to carry the weight of his unresolved anxiety about it. This is the quality of ground Section 4 was pointing toward when it named the inner work as the precondition for genuine outward movement. The apprentice attending to her own footing on the pole is not merely keeping herself safe. She is developing, through the consistent practice of that attention across time and across increasingly difficult conditions, exactly the quality Punna demonstrated in Savatthi before he walked west. The footing, tended honestly and continuously, becomes the root. The root, grown deep enough, produces warmth that the weather cannot erode. The teaching was not designed for monks alone, and the 500 people of Sunaparanta were not monastics. They were people living ordinary lives in a difficult region, and what reached them was a quality of genuine warmth operating from a ground they could not destabilize because they had no access to the root. What they had access to was the fruit, presence that did not require their cooperation, patience that did not perform itself, and equanimity alive enough to actually meet them where they were, rather than where a practitioner might have preferred them to be. Within the quality of ground Punna had developed, there is something that the earlier sections, on clinging, on releasing what has completed its work, on the impersonal causes of suffering, on the protection that flows outward from honest inner work, were each approaching from a different angle. There is a specific form that upekkha takes when the mind meets the body's signals rather than overriding them, when feeling tone is met with genuine attention rather than managed from a distance. A monk recorded the precise interior moment of this meeting in verses that have survived 2,500 years, and what he described in them is where the next teaching begins. The road they were walking that morning was ordinary in every visible respect. The dust, the distance, the particular quality of light at that hour, nothing in any of it was remarkable. Nagasamala was the Buddha's attendant on that journey, walking a pace or two behind, carrying what needed to be carried, attending to what the road required. Then a woman appeared ahead of them on the road. She was beautifully dressed and adorned. The phrasing in the Theragatha is specific about this detail, not leaving it vague. She was moving in the opposite direction, close enough that the encounter was unavoidable. What Nagasamala recorded in his verses was not the woman. It was not what she was wearing, or how she moved, or any detail of how she appeared. What he recorded was what happened in his own mind in the fraction of a second after the seeing, a pull, a specific movement in the direction of the pleasant, an interior signal that said, more attention is warranted here. Something in the quality of what had been encountered was registering as desirable, and the registering was producing a lean toward it. He watched that pull arise. This is what makes his verses worth examining across 2,500 years. Not that he felt the pull, but that he saw it clearly as it was happening. The verses do not describe a battle. They do not describe heroic resistance or a practiced act of will directed against temptation. They describe the specific act of accurate observation. Something arose in the mind, and that arising was seen clearly enough that the automatic sequence from arising to following was interrupted, not by force, but by the precision of the seeing itself. The teaching this verse records belongs to the second foundation of mindfulness, which the Satipatthana Sutta describes with considerable precision. Of the four foundations, mindfulness of body, of feeling tone, of mind states, and of mental objects, the second is frequently the least understood and the most consequential in daily life. Feeling tone, in the canon's specific use of the term, does not mean emotion. It means something considerably more elemental, the valence of every experience as it arrives, before the mind has elaborated it into anything more complex. Emotion is already a constructed response containing interpretation, memory, story, and physical sensation woven together. Feeling tone is prior to all of that. It is what arrives first, before the mind has done any of its elaborating work. Every moment of contact, eye meeting a sight, ear meeting a sound, mind meeting a thought, produces a feeling tone. Pleasant, unpleasant, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. These three are the only options, and one of them arises with every contact, without exception. The feeling tone is not a judgment or an evaluation. It is the raw quality of the contact, as the mind first receives it, before interpretation, before narrative, before any deliberate response has been formulated. The Sayutta Nikaya contains a teaching that extends this three-part framework in a direction daily practitioners find immediately useful. The canon distinguishes between worldly feeling tones and unworldly ones. A pleasant feeling tone arising from sense contact with an attractive object is worldly. It enters through the 6 sense bases and carries the momentum of the craving chain behind it. A pleasant feeling tone arising through the practice itself, the quiet ease that settles into a mind that has genuinely softened its grip the warmth that arises naturally from extending loving kindness without agenda, is unworldly. Both are pleasant. Their qualities are distinct from each other in ways that become recognizable through practice. The worldly pleasant feeling tone carries a kind of urgency, an edge of reaching already present in the pleasure itself. The unworldly pleasant feeling tone is more like warmth without demand, present, nourishing, and not requiring anything to sustain it. Learning to recognize the difference between them is part of what Vedana, Anupassana, makes possible across time. In the dependent origination chain, feeling tone occupies a specific and critical position. Contact produces feeling tone. Feeling tone in the untrained mind produces craving or aversion. Craving or aversion produces grasping. Grasping produces suffering. The chain runs automatically in a mind that has not developed the capacity to meet feeling tone without the next step firing. The entire sequence, from the moment of contact to the arising of suffering, can complete itself so rapidly that the mind has no experience of having chosen any of it. It simply finds itself in craving or aversion already mid-sequence, as if the contact and the craving were a single event rather than a chain with links between them. What mindfulness of feeling tone makes visible is the link. The space between contact and craving exists in every moment, but is ordinarily too fast and too habitual to be noticed. In that space lives what the practice is cultivating, the capacity to meet the pleasant feeling, tone without the lean toward more, and to meet the unpleasant feeling, tone without the flinch away from it. The seeing is clear enough that the automatic continuation of the sequence pauses, and in that pause, the feeling tone completes itself without becoming anything further. Feeling tone is not only experienced in the mind, it lives in the body simultaneously and can be located there with genuine accuracy if the attention is brought to it directly. The pleasant feeling tone of an attractive contact carries a physical quality, a kind of opening, a warmth concentrated somewhere in the chest or the throat, a very slight forward lean in the body's orientation. The unpleasant feeling tone of an unwelcome contact carries its own physical signature, a tightening, often at the solar plexus or across the shoulders, a quality of the body gathering itself against something. The neutral feeling tone has the most subtle body quality of all, a kind of flatness or stillness, the absence of either the opening or the tightening. Attending to where feeling tone lives in the body, rather than only to its mental quality, gives the practice a concrete ground that the mind's speed can disrupt, but the body's slower signal cannot. The body is often still registering the feeling tone clearly. At the precise moment, the mind has already moved 3 steps further into elaboration. The neutral feeling tone deserves particular attention here because it is the one most consistently overlooked. Much of ordinary daily experience arrives with neither a pleasant nor an unpleasant quality. The background texture of a normal morning, the sensation of sitting in a familiar room, the contact of breath with the inside of the nostrils during quiet moments. The untrained mind responds to neutral feeling tone with a specific and costly reflex: restlessness. When nothing arriving is strongly pleasant or strongly unpleasant, the mind generates its own stimulation by reviewing the past or anticipating the future or producing anxiety about the absence of engagement. Neutral feeling tone in the untrained mind is rarely met as neutral. It is met as a signal that something is wrong with the present moment, that it is insufficient, and that something more interesting must be found. The practice of meeting neutral feeling tone as neutral, clearly, without adding the restlessness that converts neutrality into a problem, is where the therapeutic value of Vedana practice becomes most available in daily life. Much of what most people describe as the inability to be still, the compulsive reaching for the phone, the difficulty simply being in a quiet room without doing something to it, is the untrained response to neutral feeling tone. The moment offers nothing strongly pleasant or strongly unpleasant, and the mind produces movement to address the perceived insufficiency. Meeting neutral feeling tone as neutral does not eliminate the preference for pleasant experience. It removes the specific suffering generated by treating the absence of pleasant experience as a condition requiring correction. Memory carries feeling tones in a way that extends their reach far beyond the moment of original contact. A pleasant experience from last week can be recalled with sufficient vividness that its feeling tone reasserts itself in the present moment, generating craving for a repetition of something that has already passed and cannot be exactly repeated. An unpleasant experience, recalled clearly enough, reinstates its unpleasant feeling tone, producing aversion towards something that is not currently present. Much of what people experience as anxiety is this mechanism. Feeling, tones from anticipated future contacts arriving in the present through the mind's projection, producing craving or aversion toward events that have not yet occurred and may not occur in the form imagined. Mindfulness of feeling tone includes recognizing when the feeling tone currently present in the body has been generated by memory or imagination rather than actual contact, and meeting that feeling tone with the same quality of clear attention as any other, without the additional distress of believing that the imagined or remembered source is a current reality requiring response. Nagasamala was walking a road when the encounter happened. He was not in formal meditation, not sitting with eyes closed on a prepared cushion, not in the specific conditions most people associate with mindfulness practice. He was doing what wandering monks did for months of the year, moving through ordinary circumstances, encountering whatever the road produced. The mindfulness of feeling tone, the Satipatthana Sutta describes, is not a seated practice that produces benefits between formal sessions. It is the capacity developed through formal practice that becomes available in exactly these unremarkable moments, on a road, in an ordinary morning, when something beautiful approaches and the pull arises before any deliberate thought has had time to form. What his verses describe is the sequence in the moments after the arising. The pleasant feeling tone was present. He noted it, not by labeling it in clinical language, but by remaining genuinely present to what was happening in his own mind rather than in the external event. The mind's attention, rather than flowing toward the attractive object through the channel the feeling tone had opened, turned toward the feeling tone itself. What is this? Exactly. Where does it live? In the body. What is its quality? And what is its relationship to the arising and passing that every feeling tone follows when left to complete itself without interference? Feeling tones are impermanent in a way directly available to observation. A pleasant feeling tone, met with attention rather than pursuit, does not intensify into craving. It completes its natural arc, arising, reaching its peak, and passing. The arc is brief. What extends it, what converts a feeling tone into the sustained craving that then pursues its object across hours or days, is the mind's response to it. The reaching for more, the story constructed around the pleasant contact, the elaboration of a momentary quality into a project of acquisition or preservation. Remove those responses by meeting the feeling tone with clear attention rather than automatic elaboration, and what remains is the arc, brief, self-completing, leaving nothing in its wake that demands to be resolved. The Satipatthana Sutta describes the practice of feeling tone with the precision characteristic of the canon's most important instructions. The practitioner knows the pleasant feeling as pleasant, the unpleasant feeling as unpleasant, and the neutral feeling as neutral. The knowing is complete. The experience is fully received. What changes is the relationship between the receiving and the next step in the sequence that ordinarily follows automatically. Nagasamala was not practicing the absence of response to what he encountered. He was practicing a specific quality of presence to his own response, seeing it clearly enough that the automatic continuation of the sequence paused, and in that pause, the feeling tone completed itself without becoming anything more. The Therigatha verses are personal in a way that canonical texts rarely are. They are records of interior experience, preserved because what they describe was considered instructive. Nagasamala did not write from above his experience. He wrote from inside it, describing what actually happened in his mind on that road, including the pull, including the quality of seeing that met the pull, including what followed from the seeing. He did not claim to have felt nothing. He claimed to have seen clearly what he felt, and to have found that the seeing itself was sufficient. Most people have had the experience of a craving that ran its course without being acted on, not because willpower forced it to stop, but because the attention was present enough at the moment of feeling tone that the automatic elaboration did not fire in the usual way. A particular quality of hunger that met with genuine attention turned out to be tiredness rather than the need for food it had presented itself as. The restlessness that, when sat with honestly for a few minutes, resolved into a desire for movement rather than the habitual distraction it typically produced. These are small instances of the same capacity Nagasamala was describing in a more developed form. The mechanism is identical. The practice deepens the availability of it. What makes the practice of Vedana, Anupassana, particularly consequential is its position in the chain. Working at the level of feeling tone is working at a considerably earlier point than most people imagine when they think about changing habitual patterns. The usual approach to a persistent craving is to meet it after it has already gathered strength, after the wanting has become a project, after the mind has constructed multiple reasons why the wanting makes sense. Meeting craving at that point involves genuine effort, and the effort feels like resistance, because by that stage, there is something with momentum to be resisted. Meeting the feeling tone before the elaboration fires is meeting the same sequence at the very beginning, before it has gathered weight, when the quality of clear seeing is genuinely sufficient to interrupt the continuation. The practice connects directly to the teachings that preceded it tonight. Section 1 named how Upadana converts experience into requirement. Feeling tone is the link in the chain where that conversion begins. The pleasant contact produces a pleasant feeling, tone, and the automatic lean toward more is the first movement of Upadana forming. Meeting the feeling tone clearly interrupts that first movement before it gathers weight. Section 3 named the 8 causes of experience, and the second arrow, that incorrect attribution, adds. The second arrow is added at the level of feeling tone. The unpleasant feeling, tone of difficulty, becomes the craving for explanation, which becomes the narrative of moral deservingness, which becomes suffering layered onto suffering. Meeting the unpleasant feeling tone as unpleasant, clearly, without elaboration, interrupts the chain before the second arrow forms. Nagasamala walked on. The road continued. What he had seen clearly in himself, the pull, the quality of the pleasant feeling, tone, the specific nature of what the mind had produced in that moment, passed through its arc and did not become anything more than what it was. His verses record this without triumph and without drama. The quality of seeing was sufficient. The seeing was the practice. The practice had been prepared across years, so that in this ordinary moment, on this unremarkable road, it was simply available. The capacity that mindfulness of feeling tone develops contains one specific trap, consequential enough that the canon addresses it directly. A mind developing clarity about its own arising states can convert that clarity into a new object of attachment, a new identity organized around the sophisticated quality of its own observation. The watcher watching the pull can become a watcher watching itself, watching the pull. And somewhere in that sequence, the original simplicity of clear seeing gets replaced by a more elaborate performance of clear seeing that serves the need for a certain self-image more than it serves the actual arising and passing of experience. A monk poet in the early community caught himself in exactly this pattern, returned for help, caught himself again, and kept returning for years. His honest record of that loop is where the next teaching begins. Something happens in a community when one person's gift is markedly visible. The gift gets named, sought out, relied upon, and gradually becomes part of how the community understands itself, a resource it draws on, a quality it takes pride in having among its members. The person with the gift often finds this happening without having invited it or being able to prevent it. The gift is simply there, operating with its own momentum, doing what gifts do when they encounter the conditions that allow them to be expressed. The community's recognition follows as naturally as water finding the lowest point, and the person placed by that recognition into a specific position finds themselves in a relationship with their own gift that is almost impossible to hold without at least some portion of conceit attaching to the holding. Vangisa was the early Buddhist community's poet. His gift was so clearly beyond what any other monk in the Sangha possessed that the comparison was rarely even implicit. It was simply the obvious fact of the situation, acknowledged without dispute. He composed in praise of the Buddha, in elegy for teachers who had died, in celebration of the practice and the community's progress. When something needed to be expressed with beauty and precision, it was Vangisa who was asked. The words arrived in him fully formed, the cadences settled into place, without visible effort. What he produced had the quality that separates genuine poetic gift from practiced competence in a way everyone present could immediately feel. His verses are still read today, not only as historical records, but as works of genuine quality that have survived on their own merits. When the elder Sauriputta's passing needed to be commemorated, it was Vangisa's words the community reached for. That staying power matters as context for the difficulty he was working with. The conceit was attached to something real, which is precisely what makes it hardest to see and hardest to loosen. He also knew he had the gift, and he knew that he knew, and the knowing of the knowing was itself a problem he spent years honestly working with. The Theragatha preserves his verses across a sequence that reveals, without smoothing it over, a pattern of remarkable honesty. He caught himself enjoying the attention his verses received. He caught himself comparing his work to what other monks produced and finding his own superior. He caught himself feeling the specific pleasure of being sought out, consulted, recognized, the warmth of being the person others came to when excellence was required. And then, having caught himself, he went to Ananda and asked for help. Ananda gave him a teaching. Vangisa went away and composed more verses. And then he caught himself again, this time feeling proud of how honestly he had caught himself the first time. This is the loop the Theragatha preserves. He returned to Ananda. The teaching was given again. Vangisa went away, composed, and eventually caught himself experiencing a subtle satisfaction at the quality of his own self-observation. The loop is the teaching. He did not suppress what he found or perform remorse about it. He brought it into the open and worked with it as precisely and carefully as he worked with the verses themselves. The quality of his honesty about the conceit matched the quality of his gift. The Theragatha does not describe what became of Vangisa in the end. It preserves his process, not his arrival point. That absence of clean resolution is not an oversight in the record. It is an honest account of what working with deep-rooted conceit actually looks like across a lifetime of genuine practice. The canon addresses what Vangisa was encountering under the term mana, conceit. In the Anguttara Nikaya and throughout the Pali Canon's analysis of the mind, mana is identified as one of the 10 fetters binding the practitioner to suffering, and critically, it is one that persists long after wrong view of self has been released. A practitioner can understand clearly that there is no fixed, permanent self, can hold that understanding with genuine conviction, while mana continues to operate in the mind as a comparative function. The canon describes 3 forms: the conceit of superiority, I am better than; the conceit of equality, I am the same as; the conceit of inferiority, I am worse than. All 3 involve the same foundational move, measuring a self against another self, generating a position, and finding some quality of satisfaction or dissatisfaction in the position arrived at. The measuring itself is the problem, not the direction the measurement goes. The conceit of equality is often the most overlooked of the 3. When a practitioner compares themselves to another and arrives at equality, finding a counterpart, a mirror, a confirmation that one is on the same level as someone recognizably impressive, the warmth of the recognition is real. But that warm recognition is being generated by a comparison, and the comparison is mana wearing the face of genuine resonance. The position of equality is still a position, still requiring the other person to remain appropriately impressive in order to sustain it. This is why mana is identified as a fetter that persists into the very late stages of the path. The first 7 fetters, including wrong view of self, doubt, and sensual desire, are released at stages well before full liberation. Mana is among the 3 remaining alongside restlessness and ignorance, releasing only at arahatship. That sequence communicates something precise. The comparative function outlasts even the explicit wrong view of self that ordinarily sustains it. The self-view can be seen through clearly, and still the measuring continues, drawing its material from whatever is available: gifts, progress, quality of self-observation, until the very ground from which measuring occurs is no longer available. What mana specifically feeds on in spiritual communities is worth naming carefully. In ordinary secular environments, conceit organizes itself around visible markers: wealth, status, achievement, These are obvious enough that most practitioners develop at least some capacity to notice them in themselves. Spiritual environments offer a different set of markers that are considerably harder to catch. The depth of one's practice, the quality of one's understanding, the subtlety of one's self-observation, the consistency of one's composure under difficulty. All of these are genuinely valuable qualities. All of them can be quietly measured against others. The measuring, when it occurs around qualities that are supposed to signify transcendence of measuring, produces a conceit considerably harder to catch, precisely because catching it seems to undermine the ground it is standing on. The most insidious marker of all is equanimity when things are difficult. When equanimity in difficulty becomes something a practitioner is aware of and subtly proud of, the equanimity has been co-opted. The practitioners around them who are struggling visibly with the same difficulty become inadvertent material for the comparison the conceit is quietly conducting. Van Gieser was running the conceit of superiority through his gift. The gift was real. The conceit was also real. The two coexisted in the same mind, and the presence of genuine ability did not dissolve the conceit. It supplied it with better material. Every time the verses were praised, the conceit had fresh fuel. Every time someone sought him out specifically, the position he occupied relative to others became satisfying in a way that operated below the level of deliberate thought. The praise arrived as pleasant feeling tone. The conceit was the elaboration the mind added to that feeling tone before clear seeing had a chance to meet it. What makes his pattern particularly instructive is what happened when the self-observation developed. Once he began watching his own conceit clearly enough to catch it in the moment of arising, to see the pride forming before it had fully settled into a position, the observation itself became available as new material for conceit. I am the kind of practitioner who watches himself honestly. I am the kind of practitioner who catches what others miss in themselves. I am the kind of practitioner who returns for help rather than pretending the problem is resolved. Each of these is a subtle conceit wearing the clothing of virtue. Each is genuinely harder to see than the original pride in the verses, precisely because it is organized around something that actually is a quality of practice. He went back to Ananda each time, and that consistency of return matters more than it might appear. Ananda was the Buddha's personal attendant across 25 years, present at more teachings than almost any other disciple, and known throughout the community for a quality of sustained attentiveness the Buddha explicitly praised. Van Gieser going to Ananda rather than to the Buddha directly was a practitioner locating himself accurately in relation to what he needed. Not a single transformative encounter, but a consistent relationship of honest disclosure with a trustworthy and attentive witness. Mana does not dissolve through grand encounters with exceptional wisdom. It dissolves through repeated honest disclosure in relationships that can hold the disclosure steadily and return the practitioner to practice rather than to a position. The ego that successfully protects itself disguises its vulnerabilities and does not present them for examination. Van Gieser's returns were not the behavior of an ego successfully protected. They were the behavior of a practitioner who had developed enough genuine honesty to keep bringing what he found in himself into the light, even when finding it repeatedly was evidence that the previous helping had not entirely succeeded. The loop did not diminish him. The returning was the practice. The canon's treatment of mana includes a specific observation about why conceit persists so long in practitioners who have made genuine progress. Progress itself generates mana material. A practitioner who has genuinely released significant attachment has something real to refer to. I have done real work. I have changed substantially. I am not where I was. All of these statements may be accurate. The comparing function that generates a position from them, the quiet measurement of this changed self against those who have not changed as much, is mana continuing to operate through accurate material. The accuracy of the self-knowledge does not neutralize the conceit. It supplies it with better evidence. There is a specific connection between what Section 6 described and the mechanism through which mana re-enters, even the practice of noticing. The pleasant feeling tone that arises at the moment of genuine self-observation is real. The quality of having seen something true produces a real warmth. Mindfulness of feeling tone, applied carefully, can meet that warmth as the pleasant feeling tone it is. But the practitioner who has developed skill in self-observation has also developed the capacity to construct increasingly sophisticated stories around pleasant feeling tones, stories more nuanced and more convincingly virtuous than the pride in the verse praise, but operating through exactly the same mechanism. The elaboration is faster, quieter, and better dressed than what it replaced. The mechanism is identical. Working with mana in daily practice has a specific texture worth naming concretely. When a comparative thought arises, when the mind generates, "I am better than," or "I am worse than," in any of its countless variations, the practitioner notes it clearly, as feeling tone is noted in the previous teaching. Not following the comparison into its conclusions, and not suppressing it by refusing to acknowledge it arose, but meeting it with the same quality of clear attention that interrupts any other automatic elaboration. What the noting changes across practice is not the arising. The comparative function continues. What changes is what the comparison finds when it arrives. A mind that no longer needs to inhabit the position the comparison produces, because the ground of practice has become stable enough not to require external confirmation of its own quality. There is a form of equanimity that mana is particularly good at mimicking. A practitioner who has developed genuine calm can also perform calm, producing the surface appearance of steadiness, while something underneath carefully monitors whether the steadiness is being noticed and appreciated. The performance and the genuine quality can be active in the same mind at the same time, often without the practitioner being able to clearly distinguish which is operating. The test the canon offers is internal, when the steadiness is not noticed, when no one registers the calm, when the equanimity receives no acknowledgement. What moves in the mind in that moment? a subtle movement of disappointment, of deflation, the quiet sense that the quality of what was offered should have been seen. This is mana reporting through the back channel. Genuine equanimity has no such channel. It does not require an audience because it was not being produced for one. What eventually changes in genuine practitioners is not that mana stops arising. The comparative function has deep roots and does not dissolve through a single insight or a single honest conversation with a trusted teacher. What changes is what the conceit finds when it arrives, a quality of inner space that has become practiced enough at meeting arising states that even mana's arising is met with clear seeing rather than followed automatically. The conceit forms, and the forming is seen, and the seeing does not add the additional conceit of pride in the seeing, because the ground from which the seeing operates has become stable enough to meet the conceit without feeding it. The humility this produces is not performed. It has no surface to perform on because it is not generated for an audience. It does not speak softly in order to appear humble. It does not volunteer its own failures in order to demonstrate the courage of self-disclosure. When Punna answered the Buddha's questions about Sunaparanta, this was the quality he demonstrated, not performing steadiness for the Buddha's assessment, but describing what would actually arise in him. The line between genuine and performed is what mana mimics and cannot cross. It is what remains when the comparative function meets clear seeing often enough that it no longer generates a position worth inhabiting. Vangisa is not presented in the canon as a cautionary figure. He is presented as an honest one. His verses survived not because they documented a monk who mastered the problem quickly, but because they documented a monk who kept bringing the problem honestly into the light, and whose honesty about the re-entry of pride through each successive form was itself a teaching the community found worth preserving. The Theragatha did not keep only the verses of the cleanly successful. It kept the verses of those who described the territory accurately, including the territory of repeated failure at the same junction. A practitioner reading about Vangisa who immediately recognizes the loop, who sees it clearly, feels the recognition with some warmth of insight, and notes that they too have been running exactly this pattern, is at risk of the same move Vangisa made at each stage. The recognition is genuine. The insight is real. The warmth of having seen something true is itself a pleasant feeling tone. The mind will elaborate that feeling tone into a position if the quality of attention from the previous section is not meeting it. What arises in the mind at the moment of genuine insight is a feeling tone. That feeling tone can be met clearly, or it can be added to. The adding is mana finding its next door. What the final section of tonight's teaching offers is the ground all of these interior movements ultimately resolve into, not in the absence of contact with the world, not in withdrawal from what is difficult, but in the specific quality of mind that meets the world without the chain from contact to craving, completing automatically. A teaching from the Sayutta Nikaya redefines what it means to truly live alone in a way that has nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the ground these 7 sections have been building toward. Migajala had a question about solitude. He brought it to the Buddha in the form most genuine questions arrive, as a phrase he had heard used repeatedly in teachings and in conversation among practitioners, without being sure he understood what it actually meant. The phrase was simple enough on its surface: dwelling alone, and its opposite, dwelling with a partner. He wanted to know what distinguished one from the other. It was a reasonable question, and the answer he was expecting was probably reasonable too. Dwelling alone, a monk in a forest hermitage, away from settlements, practicing in physical solitude, without the complications of community life. Dwelling with a partner, a monk among others, in a monastery or a village, navigating the particular difficulties of shared space and shared practice. The social reading of the phrase was obvious. It was almost certainly the reading most people in that community were working with. The Buddha's answer had nothing to do with geography. A person who encounters a sight through the eye, who sees something beautiful, something threatening, something that carries a strong feeling tone in any direction, and in whom that contact produces delight, or longing, or aversion that reaches past the moment of contact into a story about what was seen, or a project of pursuing it, or a plan for avoiding it. This person, the Buddha said, dwells with a partner. It does not matter whether they are in a crowded city or in a hermitage 2 days' walk from the nearest village. The partner is not a person. The partner is the craving that has attached itself to the contact. Wherever the person goes, the partner goes with them. A person who encounters the same sight, the same sound, the same smell, taste, touch, or mental object, and in whom the contact produces feeling tone, without the subsequent firing of craving or aversion, who meets what arrives as what it actually is, without the chain from contact to elaboration completing, this person dwells alone. Surrounded by others, in the middle of a market, in a family home full of the continuous activity of people who need and want and speak and disagree, this person dwells alone, in the precise and significant sense the Buddha intended. Solitude is not a geography. It is the quality of the meeting between the mind and what it encounters. The Migajala Sutta sits in the Sayutta Nikaya section on the 6 sense bases, and that placement carries the same precision that the Saddaka Sutta's placement in the Mindfulness section carried. The 6 sense bases, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, are the entry points through which all experience arrives. Every contact that has featured in tonight's teaching entered through one of these 6. The sight that produced a pleasant feeling tone in Nagasamala on the road, the verbal exchange that produced either craving for agreement or aversion, to challenge, the contact of a thought about an outcome that has not yet occurred, producing anxiety through the mind base as vividly as any physical sense contact. All of it enters through the 6 sense bases, and all of it produces either the quality of dwelling with a partner or the quality of dwelling alone, depending entirely on what the meeting between that contact and this particular mind produces in the moment of contact. What the Buddha described to Migajala is the whole of what the 8 sections of tonight have been building from different angles. Section 1, named how upadana, clinging, converts a moment of contact into a sustained project. The pleasant contact becomes a requirement. The requirement becomes a demand on the person or situation encountered, and the mind is no longer meeting what is actually present, but managing its relationship with what it has decided must remain. That is the precise architecture of dwelling with a partner. The partner is the requirement. The partner accompanies every encounter, measuring what arrives against what was demanded, and producing satisfaction or suffering based on the measurement. Section 2, named the relay chariot structure. Every vehicle released at its proper post creates the condition for the next vehicle to appear. Dwelling alone, in the Migajala sense, is the quality of mind that a practitioner has been building through each released vehicle, not as a destination arrived at when all the vehicles have been set down, but as the incremental quality that develops through the setting down of each one. Each release is a small practice in meeting what is present, rather than insisting on the vehicle that has already completed its work. Each release builds the ground from which genuine contact without the partner of craving attaching to it, becomes more consistently available. Section 3, named the 8 causes of experience, and the second arrow that wrong attribution adds. The second arrow is precisely the partner the Buddha described to Migajala. It does not arrive with the first arrow. It is added by a mind that cannot meet the unpleasant contact without the elaboration of moral narrative, self-prosecution, or the demand for cosmic explanation. Removing the second arrow is not removing feeling tone from pain. It is meeting the pain without the partner that converts it into ongoing suffering. The pain is the contact. The second arrow is the craving for a different past, craving for a different explanation, craving for the pain to carry a meaning that would at least make its presence justifiable. Meeting the pain without those cravings is dwelling alone in the pain. It does not make the pain smaller. It makes the pain only what it is. Section 4, named the specific quality of attention the apprentice described at the base of the pole, attending to one's own footing with complete honesty. Dwelling alone in the Migajala sense requires exactly this, not the monitoring of external conditions to determine whether craving or aversion should fire, but the quality of attention to what is actually arising in this moment, in this mind, through this contact. The practitioner who is watching the other performer's balance is a practitioner whose attention has left their own contact and is pursuing an external object. The partner has been installed. The practitioner who maintains full attention to their own footing, to what is arising in them, in this moment, through this contact, is practicing the quality of alone, dwelling even at height, even in a shared performance, even in a relationship of genuine mutual care. Section 5, showed what the developed form of this quality looks like from the outside. Punna, walking west into conditions he had honestly reckoned with, meeting each hypothetical increment of difficulty without the craving for it to be different. The people of Sunaparanta were his contacts through the 6 sense bases. What they said entered through the ear base, what they did entered through the eye and body bases. How their presence felt entered through all of them simultaneously. What his equanimity protected was not his physical safety, but the quality of alone dwelling through all of that contact. The warmth did not require the contact to be pleasant. The craving for pleasant contact was not the ground from which he was operating. He was genuinely alone in the Migajala sense, regardless of how many people surrounded him. Section 6 named the specific link in the chain where the partner enters. Feeling, tone. Nagasamala, on the road, met a pleasant feeling tone with clear attention rather than with the automatic elaboration that converts pleasant feeling tone into craving. That meeting, brief, ordinary, unremarkable in its setting, was a moment of genuine, alone dwelling in the middle of a shared road, in the middle of an ordinary morning. The Migajala teaching names what that moment was. Not the suppression of feeling, not the management of contact from a careful distance, but the specific quality of meeting contact as it actually is, clearly enough that the partner does not form. Section 7 named the most subtle partner of all, the mana that forms around the quality of one's own practice and observation. A practitioner who has developed skill in alone dwelling, who can meet contact without the partner of craving forming, and who then notices the pleasant feeling tone of that accomplishment and allows it to elaborate into the position, I am someone who dwells alone, has installed a partner through the practice of alone dwelling itself. The conceit of spiritual attainment is a partner. It accompanies every subsequent contact, measuring what arrives against the self-image of the practitioner who has moved beyond measurement. Vangisa caught this repeatedly and returned to the work of meeting it without following the elaboration. That return is alone, dwelling practiced at the most interior level available. What Migajala received in exchange for his straightforward question about solitude was a complete teaching on the nature of suffering and its cessation, compressed into a description of 2 qualities of meeting. Dwelling with a partner is suffering, described from the inside, the mind that cannot meet contact as contact but adds to it, reaches for more of it, pushes against it, constructs a continuous narrative around it that accompanies every subsequent moment. Dwelling alone is what the cessation of that pattern actually feels like from the inside. The mind that meets contact, receives the feeling, tone it produces, and allows the feeling tone to complete its arc, without the next step in the chain, firing automatically. The teaching is not describing a permanent state achieved once and maintained thereafter. Contact is continuous. The 6 sense bases do not close. Every moment of waking life involves contact through at least one of them, and every contact produces a feeling tone, and every feeling tone carries the possibility of the chain continuing automatically into craving or aversion. Dwelling alone is therefore not a destination the practitioner arrives at and inhabits permanently. It is a quality of meeting that becomes more consistently available through practice, through the development of the mindfulness of feeling tone that Section 6 described, through the stability of ground that the preceding sections built from different angles. There are moments of alone dwelling in the life of every practitioner. There are moments in the life of every advanced practitioner where the partner forms. What the practice changes across time is the ratio between them and the speed with which the partner is noticed when it forms. The practical texture of this teaching in daily life is worth examining specifically because the Miggajala frame makes certain experiences immediately recognizable. The meeting that begins with genuine interest in another person and gradually shifts into the management of how that person sees you. At the point of that shift, the partner has formed. The work that begins with genuine engagement and gradually becomes the management of what the outcome will confirm about you. At the point of that shift, the partner has formed. The practice that begins with genuine attention and gradually becomes the performance of practice for an internal observer monitoring how the practice appears. At the point of that shift, the partner has formed. Recognizing the moment of formation, the precise point at which contact became something the mind is managing rather than meeting, is the practical exercise the Miggajala teaching makes available. Recognition is sufficient to interrupt the chain. This is not a claim about perfection of practice. It is the same mechanism Section 6 described through Nagasamala. The seeing is the interruption. The moment the mind recognizes that it has installed a partner, that it is no longer meeting what is present, but managing what it requires the present to be, the recognition itself is a return to contact. Brief, real, a small instance of alone dwelling, arriving inside a passage of dwelling with a partner. The practice is the accumulation of those returns across every ordinary day through every unremarkable contact that the 6 sense bases bring without announcement. Impermanence is the ground on which the Miggajala teaching stands, and it is worth naming why. The partner forms because the mind encounters something pleasant and treats the pleasant feeling tone as a signal that this must continue. The craving for continuation is the partner. Impermanence makes that craving structurally futile. The pleasant contact will pass, regardless of how tightly the craving grips it, and the grip itself converts the pleasant experience into the anxiety of potential loss, while the experience is still present. Meeting the pleasant contact with clear attention, receiving the feeling tone fully, without craving for its continuation, allows the contact to be fully present for exactly as long as it is present, and then to pass, without the pain of loss added to the ending. The same structure operates with unpleasant contact. The partner that forms around unpleasant contact is aversion, the craving for the contact to be different, to be over, to not be happening, to be explained in a way that makes it less threatening. Aversion is also a partner, also accompanying every subsequent moment, also converting the experience into something the mind is fighting rather than meeting. The unpleasant feeling tone, met clearly without the aversion partner forming, is simply unpleasant, complete, temporary, impermanent. In the same way the pleasant contact is impermanent, passing through its arc when the mind does not hold it in place through continued resistance. Migajala had come expecting a teaching about where to live. He left with a teaching about how to meet every moment of every situation he would ever inhabit. The forest hermitage offers no automatic guarantee of a lone dwelling. A practitioner who carries the partner of craving for peaceful conditions into the hermitage will meet every birdsong and every period of silence with the measuring function already operating. Is this quiet enough? Is this the peace I was looking for? Has the practice produced what I expected it to produce by now? The partner is there, in the forest, accompanying every contact through the ear base and the mind base, measuring what arrives against what was required. A practitioner in an ordinary household, with the continuous contacts of family life producing feeling tones through all 6 sense bases simultaneously, who meets those contacts with the quality of attention that allows feeling tone to complete its arc without the chain continuing. This practitioner is dwelling alone in a house full of people. The children's demands through the ear base, the colleague's irritation through the eye base, the physical tiredness registering through the body base at the end of a long day, all of it arriving, all of it producing feeling tones, all of it meeting a mind that receives what arrives as what it actually is, without the partner forming through each contact. That is alone dwelling. That is what Migajala asked about, translated from the forest into the actual conditions of most people's lives. The 8 sections of tonight have each been describing one specific aspect of the partner, the many forms that the craving which attaches to contact can take. The partner of upadana, converting pleasant contact into requirement. The partner of misidentified endings, converting completion into loss. The partner of wrong attribution, converting impersonal difficulty into moral verdict. The partner of misplaced attention, monitoring the other performer's balance rather than one's own. The partner of apathy mistaken for equanimity, managing contact from a distance rather than meeting it fully. The partner of automatic elaboration, converting feeling tone into craving before clear seeing has had time to meet it. The partner of conceit, converting genuine insight into a position organized around the quality of the insight. All of them are forms of the same movement, the mind adding something to what arrived, reaching past the contact into what the contact can be made to provide. Dwelling alone is what remains when the mind stops adding, not through the suppression of feeling, not through the management of contact from a careful distance, not through the cultivation of spiritual indifference that Section 5 named as apathy, wearing equanimity's clothing. Through the development, across ordinary days and ordinary contacts, of a quality of meeting that receives what arrives clearly enough that the partner does not form. Tonight began with a man at a river who had secured everything he loved and said to the sky, "If you wish to reign, then reign." His security was real. His love for what he had built was real. The rain fell on it anyway, the way rain falls on everything, with complete indifference to the quality of the preparations made against it. What the monk's parallel verses pointed toward was not a different set of preparations, but a different relationship to the rain itself, meeting it as rain, receiving the contact of it as it actually was, without the partner of requiring it to cooperate. That quality of meeting is what Migajala's question was always pointing toward, even before he had asked it clearly enough to receive the answer. It is what every question in tonight's teaching was pointing toward, across 8 different angles, through 8 different stories from the Pali Canon, arriving finally here, in the ordinary moment of contact, with whatever is present right now, the sound of this voice, the sensation of the body resting against whatever is supporting it, the thoughts arising between words, and the simple, unadorned quality of meeting, that contact as it actually is. The closing has one final thing to offer, not as new teaching, but as the still point toward which everything tonight has been moving. The contact of this moment is already here. The sound of this voice arriving through the ear base. The sensation of the body resting against whatever is holding it. The breath moving in and out without being asked to. All of it arriving exactly as it is, asking nothing from you in return for arriving. 8 teachings, 8 stories from the Pali Canon, 8 angles on the same truth. The weight you have been carrying is not the weight of what happened. It is the weight of what the mind added to what happened, the requirement, the verdict, the comparison, the craving for the moment to be other than it was. That adding is what releases, gradually, honestly, without drama, through the quality of meeting that develops across ordinary days and ordinary contacts, one moment of clear seeing at a time. The rain fell on Denaya's enclosure and on the monk's road equally. It always does. What differs is only what the rain finds when it arrives. A mind gripping what it loves, or a mind already open, already receiving, already meeting what comes as what it actually is. You have been here for 3 hours. Something in you is already lighter than when you arrived. That lightness is not a feeling that will pass with sleep. It is the beginning of a way of meeting. Carry it gently into whatever tomorrow brings.